It is now, we're officially starting Volume 5, Issue number 3 today. So this would be the last issue of our publishing year. Hopefully this one will be coming out at the end of, well, I'll be collecting the work at the end of April for us to have a release party in the middle of May. And yeah, as you all know, right, the new theme is the human journey. And I've been really thinking a lot about, you know, how to approach this new theme for our next issue. Part of me was really thinking about, well, a lot of different things, especially when immigration and asylum was brought up as one of the possible topics, and then aging as another one, and how in a lot of ways those two things are different types of journeys that we take as people, you know. Y pues en todo eso, en todo mi pensar sobre el tema, estaba pensando mucho en la historia. Right? History plays a huge role in all of the work that we create. And I think that this quote that I found from Octavio Paz, who I've brought in some of his work before, if you don't remember who Octavio Paz is. Octavio Paz is a Mexican poet and journalist. He was also an ambassador to India, I believe it was, and also a Nobel laureate, Nobel Prize winning poet. And he was born on the 31st of March in 1914, and he passed away on the 19th of April in 1998. And he wrote Poesía, búsqueda de una hora y un aquí. And I translated it to say poetry, a search for a here and a now. What do you guys think about what Octavio Paz has to say about poetry?
As I told you before, when I got here and I saw it, which I got to confess,
Yeah.
it reminds me of like the senses of dimensions, right? Like a place and a time, which are two different dimensions.
Yeah.
And they basically give you more of a kind of the now, I guess, in a sense.
Mm. So place and
like
time.
a coordinate, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they can give you a sense of location,
Yeah.
right, and temporality.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
It just reminds me so much of like being present, you know, certain meditative practices that just allows you to be and take in like specific details of what you're basically living now.
Like presence of mind as well as presence of body.
Yeah, I think more so presence of body, like, you know, how do you, I guess, how do you translate this scene with all your with your five senses? You know, what does the smell tell you? What is your sight? What is your hearing?
Yeah. I like that.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say too. Kind of what it made me think of. It's just like, yeah, being present in the here and the now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like what I think poetry does. It's what it like wants you to pay attention with like all of your senses. And I think it's part of being a poet is having that. It's like learning to to like use all your senses and be very like conscious of like everything that's, you know, happening. And seeing like the little things is what makes poetry.
Yeah. Cool. I like that. It's very good interpretations. Señora Betty, ¿usted tiene algún argumento para la discusión sobre lo que dice Octavio Paz?
Es como un paisaje. O sea, está describiendo el paisaje, pero la vida de una persona.
Sí, puede ser. Sí puede ser como un tipo de paisaje, ¿verdad? Quizá como dice Mauricio, ¿verdad? Que la poesía, se supone que la poesía nos debe de pintar un paisaje, ¿verdad? Pero usando los cinco sentidos, porque como humanos no entendemos la existencia sin saberlos, sin usar los cinco sentidos, yo creo. And yeah, I think that there is a certain aspect of being present in the moment that this tries to kind of allude to. What I find interesting is specifically this word though. La búsqueda. A search. Right? So it's almost as if saying that poetry is in fact the act of finding and seeking out the here and the now. Right? So it's not just about using the five senses, I would argue. It's not just about understanding location and the time period in that particular moment. But I think personally that poetry can also be trying to understand what it means to be here and now. Right? So it's not just replicating the here and now, it's about understanding how we came to be here and now. Right?
Kind of goes back to like the process of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
As an artist, we have different ways of getting there, which is a search.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember a lot of writers, they say, oh, they get drunk and they get into a hotel and they don't leave.
Yeah.
That's kind of the journey, the process of it.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
to get from here to the result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like I was saying, you know, when I was thinking really about the theme, the human journey, right? The human journey can't be, it cannot be just one part of things, right? It's not just you are born, you live, and you die. No, it's not just that. When we create artwork, we really don't create artwork in a vacuum. You know, that's kind of the reality, right? It's informed by everything else that we've experienced. So, that being said, what are all the things that could be a part of the here and the now? What are the additional things that this could refer to? Potentially. Radu?
Well, I was just thinking, does, I was asking curious, does paz in Spanish mean peace?
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about it, that it might not be a coincidence that his name and poetry are, I mean, he was the one who wrote that poem, because for me poetry is a search for peace, and in many cases peace means that to know the here and the now.
Mm.
You won't be able to be at peace if you don't know the now, if you're not aware of the now
Mm-hmm.
and the here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
because poets, whether they write poetry out of anger or out of peace, or for peace mindset,
Mm-hmm.
they look for that, you know, to find peace in there. I mean, they pour out their anger
Mm-hmm.
in poetry in order to find peace.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, those who already have some kind of, you know, state of mind and peaceful one, they already have that. So that's interesting.
I like that.
Just,
I definitely like that, and I like that you're making the connection even with just his name, you know, and his career as a poet. You know. I think that in order for us to understand the here and the now, it's also really important for us to understand, like I said earlier, right? We don't create work in a vacuum. Everything that we do is informed by our background, it's informed by the location in which we live in, and it's informed by, ultimately, our time on this planet, right? If I'm gonna write, I can really only write from my point of view. You know, I was born in the 80s, raised in the late 80s, early 90s, and lived in San Diego, North San Diego County, right? So all of those things are gonna come out in my writing. Same with like my dad, you know, and his influence on my life and his personal history. And the fact that he comes from Mexico, and I have that cultural connection to Mexico, and that I identify as Mexican. Therefore, I also have this cultural connection to a history of colonialism, and a history of displacement, and a history of migration. And all of these things, they end up becoming part of my personal human journey. They also are part of our collective human journey too. Because all of us at some point or another have had that as part of our history. So the way that I'm trying to tie it all back in is, you know, poetry, it is about searching for a here and a now, but it's also about understanding that search for our here and now and being informed by the rest of the things that are happening outside of us. When I was in middle school, I went to one of the very first charter schools in the state of California. And part of the way that they approached their teaching was to teach these large concepts. And one of the large concepts that always stuck with me when I was growing up was this one. This idea of continuity and change. Okay. I might have brought it up before. And when you look at the words just by themselves, you kind of get a sense of what it's trying to say, right? Things continue and things change. All right, but when we really are talking about continuity and change, at least as a concept, we're talking about history. And really how history repeats itself. You know, history might be linear in that, you know, sucede un evento acá en el pasado, por ejemplo, and we'll just stick with American history, right? But you'll have something like the Civil War. The Civil War back in the 1800s was really about people fighting for, ultimately for economic control. But a result of that was also, you know, slavery, right? Freeing the slaves. So it was an ideological battle that was really based in economics. Not that long after that, you also had something that was kind of a result of the Civil War. Because of people's fear of people of color, you then had the Repatriation Act. And this was like the 1850s, if I remember right. And then the Repatriation Act of 1912. Okay. Para los que no saben sobre esa acta de Congreso, repatriación is basically what it sounds like. Repatriating people. It's taking a certain group of people, shipping them out of this country. What happened during the Repatriation Act was that a majority of Mexican Americans, so people that were here before the United States took over all of the Southwest, you know, after Mexico lost the Mexican-American War, in California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, you had these really big groups of people that held large plots of land that the United States government didn't quite exactly recognize as their land because it belonged to Mexicans, you know. So you also had too, because of the westward expansion, a very, very large group of Chinese people and of other groups from Asia that were brought over to help build the railroads and all of the other infrastructure that we now have. The Repatriation Act was an act of Congress that basically, because of the fear of people of color being too many, right? They took all of these people that owned land and all of these people from China and other Asian countries, and they actually sent them across the border to Mexico. In 1912 was when the Border Patrol was actually created. And that's when, you know, the fence actually was put up, the wall, right? That's also why now if you go to Mexicali, they have some of the best Chinese food ever, you know, and why there's a lot of Japanese settlements in places all around Baja California, up and down Baja California. And, you know, that was, again, you know, the result of this. Now, fast forward like about 50 years, and then you have this. the civil rights movement in the 60s, the 1960s. This right here was basically because this, people recognized as being wrong, right? The Japanese internment during World War II, you know, basically black people were tired of being second-class citizens, and that led to other groups, other ethnic groups and other, you know, historically marginalized groups rising up and saying, no, we demand the same rights as anyone else. Women, the LGBTQ community, all these different communities all basically rallied together to fight the oppression that had existed before. Just like here in the 1850s, right? You had this group of people that was historically marginalized, essentially saying, no, we deserve the same rights as anyone else. So the civil rights movement happened. Fast forward to, you know, another 50 years or so. And then you have the, specifically here in California, you have, oops, just write it like that. You have this happening, Prop 187.
Oh.
All right. For those of you that might remember what that was, specifically in California, Prop 187 was a proposition that was on the ballot in the early 90s that was basically trying to make sure that people that were here undocumented were not given access to things like health care, food stamps, and the fear was also that even a public education would be taken away from them, you know? And I specifically remember the environment that created. It was basically a way for Governor Pete Wilson at the time to say, we want to kick out all the people of color, all the Latinos, all the Mexicans. Yeah. So he basically had a repetition of what had happened in the early 1900s, almost 80 years later. Here, you have almost 80 years later, almost a full 100 years, something very similar happening. People fighting for their rights, fighting for equality. If you come to today, right, what are we all experiencing now? Build the wall. We're experiencing children being taken away from their parents for not doing anything illegal other than trying to get a better life. I mean, a lot of the same things that we see throughout history, they just keep happening. Things might change, right? The civil rights movement definitely tried to overcome what happened here, but, you know, that ebb and flow. Ultimately, history ends up becoming cyclical, or kind of like that.
It's
Right?
reactionary.
It is. It's reactionary. It's always reactionary. So this concept of continuity and change, that for me was really how I learned to look at history, and also how to look at my own personal story, my own life. Because if I follow some of these things that happened, I can say, wow, like my life actually kind of looks like that too. Because of the civil rights movement in the 60s, my grandparents lost their farm. They couldn't afford to pay a living wage to the farmhands. My dad, because of what happened in the 60s in Mexico, couldn't really have any kind of life for himself there. So in the late 70s and 80s, he came to the United States. His being here in the United States and having kids meant that, you know, we had to basically live under fear of possibly being split up from my parents. You know, my dad might have been deported, even though he was here legally by that point. You know, but I grew up with that fear. Here we are now, 25 years later, 30 years later, and there's kids that are living that same exact thing that I lived back in the early 90s.
And that's going to have repercussions too. What are their stories going to sound and look like when they're grown of age?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That same resentment is kind of being, you know, planted in them. They hate the country that they were born in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, and it's kind of sad that I feel that way. Well, you know, if you look at it from like a larger point of view, sort of sad that I really do not care for the United States of America, because the reality is that, you know, I benefit from the rights that we have here, you know, but I benefit from that only because I'm a U.S. citizen. If I wasn't a citizen, if I didn't have that privilege, and if I didn't even recognize that privilege, things would be very different. You know, I might be a different person. I might be in a different situation, going one way or the other way. You know, but yeah, these stories, my story, my personal story, it is informed by all of these things. All of your stories are all informed by these things too. So that goes back to what I was saying before. We do not create art in a vacuum. It doesn't stand by itself. It's always going to be informed by our journey and our collective human journey, because of this concept right here, continuity and change. The more things change, the more they stay the same. So, let's talk about that journey now. So, aquí les traje un poema. It is a little on the long side, but this poem is actually one of my poems. I think, kind of shared with the group, if not with the entire group. I know I shared with Mauricio and Caro before, that for this particular cycle, because we are talking about the human journey, I figured, you know, I might as well lead by example. You know, if I'm going to ask you guys to write about your human journey, then I'm going to do the same. So for the next few weeks, the days that I'm teaching a lesson, I'm actually going to bring a new poem, a poem that I write that reflects our human journey together, collectively. Although I do have to say that this one in particular, this one I actually wrote back in 2009. So this poem is almost 11 years old now. And when I wrote this poem, I actually specifically wrote it because there were two major things happening in my life. One of those things was I moved to LA. Este lo escribí el primer año que estuve viviendo aquí en Los Ángeles, y en ese tiempo estuve en CalArts. So I was receiving my MFA in creative writing at the time at CalArts, and I was in a lot of ways reliving the same things that I relived, or that I had lived when I was at Cal State San Marcos, when I was getting my undergrad degree, my bachelor's degree. The second major thing that happened was that I actually turned 25. So I wrote this after I turned 25. And when I turned 25, I had that realization that I was the same age as my dad when my dad had me. So I was reflecting a lot on my dad, his story, the struggles that he went through, the sacrifices that he made to be here in the United States. And I was thinking about how at the same exact age, I had the privilege of having already a formal education, having a place where, you know, I was relatively stable, and also that I had no children, and I was pursuing a master's degree in creative writing. Completely different world. I mean, almost the complete opposite of my dad's experience. So I was looking at these things, right? And I came up with this type of poem here that I ended up calling a macro poem. Right? So before we actually get into the poem, I'm going to explain what I mean by a macro poem. Are you guys all familiar with that term, macro?
Macro?
Yeah, macro. Big? Yeah. Do you guys know that macro has two definitions?
The fish or the ocean?
Hmm?
The macro, the animal?
Macaroni.
Mackerel, not mackerel.
Macro.
We're just playing with words.
Macaroni. So macro, one of the main definitions is definitely large, right? Large scale. All right, so large scale, You could think like the term macro worldview, right? Where you take a view of the entire thing, right? But I think Abraham might know this one. There's another very specific, almost technical term in photography, macro. You're talking about macro photography. You're not talking about photography that's taking a world view photo. It's actually the most narrowed down, the most intimate, the closest view that you can get. I like to think of it more in the sense of intimacy, right? Small, so it's more intimate. All right, so a macro poem, and this is something that I completely made up, so if it sounds kind of like you don't buy it, that's okay. But when I was thinking about poetry, and I was thinking about my place in history, and my story, and my dad's story, and all of these things combined, I had a realization that, like I said before, we are informed by everything that happens to us. So we're informed by this huge swath of history, right? The world, our community. And it comes down to me, to us, to the individual. So a macro poem, when I created it, is basically a poem that looks kind of like this. A little bit of an inverted triangle, right? Where you start off with the big stuff, the medium stuff, and then you. Right? So the big stuff usually will start off with things like the world view, history, and geography. So this is how the poem should start, in my estimation. Then starts to come down to community. And community can mean whatever you want it to mean. In some cases it could be family, or in other cases it could be just simply where you live, right? So the little slice of the world that belongs to you in your mind. And then last comes down to you. Who you are.
I like that technique. I have seen it in a couple movies or shows
Yeah.
where they're talking about the past, and they say, "Oh, and this year the man went to the moon, and then my parents did this, and then I was doing both."
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a filmmaking technique.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching a lot of movies at the time too, so I might have been influenced by that subconsciously. But yeah, basically that's the idea. All right, so this is what I ended up calling a macro poem. And the key here is definitely looking at things from a large scale and thinking about them in position to either the world, history, or the geography of where you live, where you're from. Then going into the idea of your community, your family, the things that are the closest to you, right? Not you specifically, but within your circle. And then you. How does all of this affect you? Who are you? How do you deal with it? Así que viene siendo casi como un tipo cosmovisión, ¿verdad? Una creencia de cómo funciona el mundo o cómo es la historia. Luego, nuestra comunidad, todo lo que nos rodea, y uno mismo. So, with that in mind, I present to you my poem. And please feel free to give me feedback, right? Like I said earlier, I'm not above the workshop. I also am not, I'm a writer and I need feedback. So if at some point you feel like, the poem is maybe a little weak in an area, or you think I could elaborate more, definitely write a note and feel free to give it back to me. Pero sí, soy poeta igual como ustedes. I was going to offer, does anybody want to read it on my behalf? Do you guys want to hear me read it?
Read the poem, man.
All right.
I mean, I don't want to speak for everyone.
California, gave away his ranch to the United States Army, who later turned his tract of land into the Marine base, Camp Pendleton. The mission San Luis Rey still holds Mass every Sunday at noon and at 10 in the morning. The occasional quinceañera goes down there. The piece of land my mom farmed with my grandparents is now a series of tract homes running along Buena Creek Road. The other plot of land they farmed and made a living with is now Major General Raymond Murray High School. I owned nothing of this land. I own nothing at this time. I've rented apartments, lived in homes that were denied to us because of our ethnic background. I've seen my family fall into foreclosure of all sorts. I work every day. I've worked since birth, avoiding death from tuberculosis, inept, distracted truck drivers, and starvation. I learned to count money by selling used golf balls with my dad at Meadow Lake Country Club. I graduated with average grades, but I graduated nonetheless. I proved that at least one Mexican can make it through high school. I attended a community college where it was common for my in-class neighbors to never make it out, alive and with degrees. Some made it out, breathing heavily for free air, undoctored air, intellectual free air. They seem happier these days, occasionally bragging about their kids and soccer games. I sat in the quads of California State University, where white students gave me the dirty eye next to the Cesar Chavez statue. I sit in a room every day now where I feel the same. Movement number 2. I'm working to make a degree work for me. It's never going to happen. That's not what it was meant for, and that is my mistake. It was my destiny since birth to be a writer, a cartoonist, an artist. I believe it will make me happy one day. I don't get as angry anymore with people that are unhappy. They create that for themselves. I pity them most of the time, and they mistake that for disrespect. Movement 3. I remember what Mami Lucy told me one day. Mijo, no te desesperes con tu mamá. Ella te quiere mucho y trabaja muy duro. I think real feminists sacrifice for their kids. Real feminists know what God's love is. I know what my mom's is, what my Mami Lucy's was, what even my dad's is. Love is asking me to come back and rebuild my life in their home without considering what I might want with my life. Am I angry at white people? Sometimes. Occasionally, but only when they forget that we are the same, and my people's suffering is a consequence of that forgetfulness. I want to reflect on the moonlight and show how the barrio is my home. I love it, I nurture it, I cherish it. Gentrification is a funny way of telling us that meat markets smell better when populated by second-hand grocery clerks and meats. No white person ever shops at the Sunrise Market unless they're living with their grandkids and they happen to be the children of construction workers. They too are immune to the unique smell of slightly refrigerated meats. I don't know if I can answer your question of what I write for, but I sure as hell can try. I'll try to like it, act like I know what I'm doing, and you won't really know the difference. Movement number 4. You might see my laugh and stare at my tears. You'll think that my name could have been Joaquin or Martin, that I may have been written about in the 80s, maybe 70s. I could have been like those other writers from yesterday, you know, the ones who write about tortillas and abuelitas. I could have been them. I could have been another son of an immigrant spick, a beaner, a wetback. I could have been that for you, but decided not to be. I decided not to follow in those footsteps. Instead, I write for me. I write for the honky calling putos on the corners who might never know anything beyond Daddy Yankee, Lil Rob, and Mr. Shadow. I write for the baby bash loving girls wearing flats and tank tops waiting for the 320 to take them to Oceanside by the harbor. I write for the Chris Brown wannabe kids who beat up on their Rihanna girlfriends mentally, but never really come around to doing it because they're afraid of what their mom will say. I write to give the world a taste of me. That taste of dirt in your mouth that smells of sweat, sand, manure, phosphates, and nitrogen. Movement 5. I want you to taste my blood between your canines. I want you to taste you, brown eyes. Taste your lovely chocolate that vanilla wants to see in their skin through tanning beds and burned out days at the beaches. Do you remember the gutters and the way they fill up with palm fronds after those late October rains? Taste that. Taste the 7-Eleven Big Gulp cups that gather and applaud in front of Royal Liquor. Taste the dirt under the La Costa Canyon backfields and their well-irrigated grassy knolls. You might get a hint of the diesel pop-burned chopping mountains in his Bobcat and Caterpillar. Visit Car Country Carlsbad and suckle on the poppies that bloom behind the Infinity dealer or the strawberries that litter the land by the factory outlets. They smell equally of commercial gains. There isn't much left of the smells in the kitchen where the flash of a calf led to the growth of the Alcocer family. Pop loved my Mommy Lucy's legs, and that was that. Grab a fistful of grass from the hills and rainbow and see if you can make a licuado of the Pichardo's sweat that streamed as La Migra chased people from the figurative snake den into the literal one. Fallbrook nurseries weren't much the same, but still led to bailes and house parties. Pal Norte is still much the same, and that's where I find myself, El Norte. Not much more Norte, but Norte nonetheless, and away from my family. Daddy says I'm at least closer than he is to his parents. I tend to agree, but the distance feels the same. It's okay. I'm at least an Amtrak ride away, a 2-hour drive away, a text away. Where does this arc go? Who knows but the air? Who knows but the clouds? Who knows but my love who sits on my couch and reads? She knows where it comes from, but can she answer me as to where it ends? Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question. Did you turn this in? Was this an assignment?
It was part of a class.
And what was the, I'm wondering what the teacher.
This was at CalArts. So when I turned in this poem along with another poem for my workshop day, the way that the teacher structured the workshop, the poets that were being workshopped couldn't say anything. We just had to sit there and listen to people talk about our writing. And then after everyone was finished talking, we were able to then say what we were thinking or what we were hoping people got out of the poem. When I turned that in and everybody came in ready to give me feedback for my workshop, the teacher,
Everybody peers?
all the other students, yeah.
And they had a chance to take it home and read it, or?
Yeah. So I had to email it in advance, and that was part of the homework. So they had to read it and then come in with notes, right, with feedback. Normally the teacher wouldn't be the one to actually say anything. She would just open it up for discussion and then everyone would talk. Normally. Of course, I was special. The teacher, and this was the person that was actually assigned to me as my mentor, quote unquote. So this was the person that knew me the most, right, most closely. That day, she started by basically taking over the first 10 minutes, picking at every single little thing that I wrote and saying that I didn't read enough, that I didn't understand the history of Chicano literature and all of the writers that came before me. As if my story, the things that I actually lived through, were somehow me repeating the things that had happened back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, right? Which, if we talk about continuity and change, right? These things that I lived through are things that, yeah, my forefathers lived through too.
But was she expecting the assignment of being you copying or having this style
No, it was just it was a poetics workshop. So all we had to do was just bring in poetry that we write to, hopefully add to our portfolio at the end as part of our thesis.
That's kind of weird. She put you in that box, even though you're telling. Because like the way I'm reading this and knowing you, I can see like the parts of you being real, being truthful of who you are, and also like you were saying the macro thing and
Mm-hmm.
placing a time and a place, especially when you're talking about your dad.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah.
you're not talking about Chicanos, that you're talking about your reality.
Yeah,
I don't,
exactly.
That makes no
I don't
sense.
understand how that could be like constructive criticism.
Well, it wasn't. Because she didn't say a single thing that she liked about my poem.
Right.
It was nothing but just her putting it down. And then,
And
because
that's
I was
before everybody else saw it.
that was before everyone else. She set the tone. I was one of 2 people of color in that class. Jan was the other one. The only 2 Latinos in basically the whole program. Everyone else was white. Guess what happened? As soon as she basically said that I wasn't Chicano enough in my writing, or that I wasn't saying anything new related to Chicano literature or Chicano writing, everyone else basically started calling it reverse racist. Because I was being critical of, white people in the poem. So,
That's rich.
This was so amazing, so good.
Thank you.
It has so much imagery, it has so much of your personal experience and the struggles of your family. It names so many places, and it's so concrete in that sense. I really liked it.
thank you.
Really liked it
Thank you.
a lot.
Yeah.
And I feel very bad for the experience that you went through, because I think that they were looking through some different glasses than to really truly pick up on the depth of this, the pain, the struggles, and that you're not giving up your fighting. And that you're not going to be like everyone else in history or what's expected of you because of what you look like or where you come from. So someone told me that people try to push you down only because you're up.
Yeah.
People try to put you down because you're up.
Yeah.
So
I appreciate that.
it's cool.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it. Like I didn't bring the poem to get praise for it, but I definitely appreciate the feedback, and I was really thinking when I was writing it exactly what I was saying here. Like it was a very intentional kind of poem. I was trying to create a new type of poem, a poem that I call a macro poem, and so yeah, that like Abraham said, I did try to place it in history, right? My first lines are, Tia Juana's was a whorehouse outside of the Mission of San Diego, So recognizing the history of the region where I'm from. And in some ways even just setting up the expectation, right? You have a mission that's a holy place. It's considered to be a holy place, but it's a place where, the Luiseño Indians were enslaved, right? And then less than a day's ride away by horse, you have a brothel. That the urban legend is that the city of Tijuana was started because of that one brothel named Tia Juana's. So like, I'm sure the city of Tijuana probably won't ever acknowledge that part of their history because it's an ugly part of it, but that's at least the urban legend that I grew up with. So that's how I tried to set up the poem, to say like, these are the things that we choose to ignore or to gloss over in history, and these are the things that do happen. This is how it informs where I am from to a certain degree. So the large worldview, the historical worldview, the geographical worldview, to then talking about my family, right? My community, the city of Vista where I grew up, and then me, what all of that means to me, how it affects me. Yes, ma'am?
It's kind of this cool thing that happens with time in here too. Because, I don't know, but from my perspective, like you start with that macro and there's this sort of history in it. So, where you sort of have a sense of going back in time past or whatever, and then there's displacement of your family and then moving into, I guess, kind of your other macro, like the very specificness of you. And then it does this cool thing where like the past and the present blend together at the end, which I thought was really neat. Like, so at the same time, at the very end, it like pulls the past into the present. So I don't know, it just was kind of fascinating how like time was used in the form. So I thought it was really
Thank you. Thank you.
Is this macro your invention?
Yeah. Yeah, and that I can remember, this is the only poem where I intentionally used this form. But I do have other poems that, as I was searching for this one, that I came across that there's elements of it there.
What do you still play with that idea?
When?
The teacher?
I mean, I just never really pushed it more,
So I feel like you were onto something really nice.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can I ask what you said?
I said actually nothing. So after all of the workshopping, right, and everybody's comments and calling it reverse racist and all of these things, I was like, okay. That was it. That's all I told them. And it was kind of nice because it frustrated everybody.
They wanted a reaction.
They wanted a reaction. I literally was there,
They want
no
to-
reaction.
Yeah.
I was my usual self. I was just very stoic, very okay. And then of course they gave me all of their work and or all of their notes and stuff. They collected it, sent it down to me at the end of the table. And then immediately after the class ended, I had everyone's notes in my hand, and I actually dropped it right in the trash can as I walked out.
Or you did the Pelosi.
Yeah, I pulled the Pelosi.
Tear 'em up.
I
Going
mean,
back to the class after that?
I had to. It was part of my master's program, so I had no choice but to continue in the class.
But this is, you said when you were in San Marcos State University, you had similar
Yeah.
experiences there. So this is like a common theme when you're trying to express yourself. Because poetry is art. It's your work, and you can write whatever you want.
Mhm.
And people can like it or not like it. But it doesn't make it wrong or deficient.
Exactly.
Or in need of more background research. It's your creation.
Mhm. Yeah, that's right. The same goes for all of you. Right? And I mean, I'm sure you might know what your homework is now, right? It's to write a macro poem too. But ultimately the thing is, right, your history, your story is equally as valid as mine. It's as equally as valid as any of the other stories in all of the books that are here at the library, regardless of, your sexual orientation, your ethnic history, your, anything. Like, everyone's story is equal because it all ties to this larger human history, our human journey, right? And there's other things too that I do in the poem that, I purposely did, like the concept of Pal Norte. That's a very, very common concept in Latino communities where everybody thinks that there's better opportunities if you go north. Doesn't matter where you are, but it's always this concept of going north. And if you look at other continents too, it's actually kind of the same thing. You go north. If you're in the southern hemisphere, it might be go south. Yes,
When I lived in Canada,
North.
I was going to, I was on the verge of becoming a Canadian citizen or having dual citizenship. And so I was studying the book, the history, and preparing for that if I did in fact make that decision. And so I was reading their national anthem, and in that anthem it says the true north.
Hmm.
I was like, what? I was like,
Yeah.
who the hell do you think you are?
Well, yeah, you know.
Anyway.
But there's something there, right? Especially for those of us that are from Latin America, or who are descended of people from you know, this continent. To go north, given our history, means something. It's not just a direction that you're going in. It's actually an ideology that you're going. You know, to go north, I didn't go that far north, but I came to LA because I recognized that in San Diego, I do not have the same opportunities that I had here. Nowhere even close to it. Here in LA, I have more opportunities. Here in LA is where I was actually able to get funding to start all of this. In San Diego, I might not have. Probably wouldn't have. You know, and if I decide to, más bien, when I'm able to, I would like to start a Distil Arts in San Diego because my community does need it. You know. But those are the things where I had to make those kind of decisions. That's why Pal Norte rang true for me. Goes back to that same concept of continuity and change. My dad came Pal Norte because he had no opportunity in Santa Lucia, Querétaro. My mom, she was born in San Diego. I mean, didn't really have much of a choice because the hospital in North San Diego County wouldn't take my grandma. So she was sent all the way down to San Diego, half an hour drive away, you know, but they lived in North San Diego County. My grandma's from Oaxaca, my grandpa's from Guadalajara, Jalisco. I mean, you know, there's El Norte there too, you know. So at least in my life, in my family, in my community in general, that idea of Pal Norte it's a significant idea. And it speaks to, again, this idea of continuity and change. Things are better if you change them, but ultimately we're just repeating the same habits, the same behaviors, for better or worse. So like all of those things, they all definitely were on my mind as I was developing this form.
It's so honest, rhythm to it, I really like it.
Thank you,
It's
Jen.
long, but it's long, but it doesn't feel long. You know, you read some people write a lot, and you're like, oh my goodness, where is this going to? I mean, I'm reading, I'm like, why like it more and more and more, and
Thank you, Jen.
had I been in that meeting, oh, I would
I appreciate that a lot.
I would ask for someone more qualified to appreciate this.
Thank you. Thank you. Radu?
I was going to ask something, but I'm not going to ask that. I'm going to ask something else. Is the structure, the way you structure it, conducive to this macro idea, like I feel it
In movements?
movements, yeah.
Yeah.
So are these movements representative of each of those?
Not necessarily. The movements, so the way that I structured it where you have movement 1, movement 2, so on and so on, that's really more a stylistic choice to sort of break them up so that a person could read one by itself, maybe come back to it later. But also, each section is kind of like its own idea or own reflection on the same topic. So they're related, but they're, you know, can stand on their own if necessary. So that's the reason why I did that. But I did really think a lot about incorporating all of these elements of this macro worldview and this macro worldview, right? So the larger, the entire community, the geography, the history, to my community, myself, and how do I live within that? How do I basically move on? Right? Yes, come.
Yes, Layerman also really enjoyed this poem. You know, I think like all of our stories are super important, and I think we should tell them, and it's you know, yeah, so, and then I really like the line at the end of the movement 4, I write to give the world a taste of me. I think it's just like, really hit home for me, because I think it is kind of like why I think I write, you know, it's because, you know, we all have I think we all have a story to tell, and I think a lot of times, like, we're told like we don't, but we all do, and I think it's important that we tell our stories. The other thing I was going to say, is this considered a prose poem?
It is.
Okay.
Alright, so it is a prose poem, and I actually did not lead with that. So for those that might be confused by that, prose, just think essay style. Whereas poetry, the standard definition of poetry is a deliberate attention to rhyme and meter. So, and that's really to create a rhythm, right? So when they exist by themselves, you know, poems look a particular way. When prose is seen, you'll see it written a lot like anything in a regular book, or like this poem here. When you combine the two, it's written in an essay style, but with an attention to certain rhythms, cadences, and meters. Right? It can be performed more than your standard prose essay. Right? So this is an example of a prose poem. You know, there's little moments where I just get a little more poetic. You know, you can hear some rhyme happening internally within a line, and you can see that some of the imagery is a little more vague. You know, that type of thing. But ultimately, when I was writing this type of poem, right, so this macro poem, I sort of came to the realization, and reading it again and preparing for today's lesson, that there's really basically 3 components to it, aside from this, or at least 3 ways in which I structured this. So it starts off with time and place. Ultimately, it's your history of history. All right, so your interpretation of history, your retelling of history, your placing, you know, of history in a particular location and time. So you could start as way far back as like the 1800s, or you can start as way far back as like 1983. You know, so that's kind of the way that the poem should start. Second, it should try to ask this question: what is my place in history? So that's where you then are able to talk a little bit about your family, your community, yourself, right? You're able to now start placing yourself within the clutter of the world. And then the last one, how do I move on? Zoe, that's great. So appropriate for the writing workshop. Reciting her ABC. So this last one, how do I move on, actually does not have to actually be answered. Because the truth is that no one can ever answer that question for themselves. Especially if you're continually growing, and especially if you're continually studying history, ultimately, right? That's why my poem does end on a question. You know, because there really is no ending to my art. There's no end to my story until I pass on, but even then, my story actually won't end if I'm fortunate enough to be remembered. So that's generally the 3 ways in which this poem can be created, or the 3 priorities, I should say, of the poem as you write it. Does anybody have any questions? Karen?
Could you invert the process, or would you wind up with something like totally different?
You could try and invert the process and see what happens. I mean, it's not like, oh,
Still will be macro anyway.
it'll still be macro. Yeah, that's why I prefer macro over macro micro.
I was gonna ask you that, why macro, not micro?
Specifically because macro, in terms of photography, it literally is the closest that you can get to an object and still have a clear focus. Whereas micro, I mean, we're talking about just minuscule, you know. So it's not the same. Macro in photography, to me, is really more the sense of intimacy.
I think I like it because it means like they exist like simultaneously. So it's like the macro and the larger and the smaller all exist like in one, you know, they're not like separate things. So that's having the same word. Yeah.
They should call microscope the macroscope.
Well, a macroscope is technically a telescope. Yeah, technically. You know, but you know that's
It's a missed opportunity.
it's all semantics at that point.
Sounds
But yeah,
nice.
I just like the sound of macro, and if you know photography, and you kind of, it helps a little bit more with the.
It's catchy.
Intimate relationships are stronger, greater
Yeah.
than
They can be.
distant relationships.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can I
yeah.
ask your title and answer
An answer. The question?
to the question?
To the assignment.
No, it's I mean the title came from the actual questions that are in the poem.
The different questions.
Yeah, because there's a couple of questions in the poem that I try to address. Like, why do I write? I think I say it. So that's where the title came from. Because it's an answer. It's not the answer. It's an answer.
I
Thank
really
you
enjoyed it.
guys for the feedback.